The wind sweeps across the barren shores of Table Bay, carrying with it the sounds of a world long forgotten. In the distance, Dutch ships glide across the waters, their sails swelling with the promise of riches, their hulls heavy with goods. From the far east, what began as a humble stopover for passing ships would soon become the birthplace of a colony whose history remains clouded in secrecy. As the sun sets over the Cape, the early settlers are no longer just strangers on unfamiliar land. They are pioneers, driven by the ambition to transform this wild terrain into something of their own. But in their wake, they leave something far more significant, something far darker. Behind the polished accounts of progress and exploration, 10 untold secrets are buried in the sand, hidden from the pages of history books. These secrets, locked away for centuries, hold the key to understanding the Cape Colony's true origins, the struggles of the indigenous Cocoa people, the horrors of slavery, the silent resistance, and the rise and fall of powerful empires. These are the stories we never hear. And yet, it is these very stories that have shaped South Africa as we know it today. But just as the city seemed to flourish, disaster would strike with merciless precision, setting in motion a chain of events that would change everything forever. Hello, I'm Dr. Adam Cameron, and this is Missing History Records. The Cape Colony, with its windswept shores and fertile land, promised a new beginning for many. For the settlers, it was a land of untapped potential, rich in resources, ripe for cultivation, and strategically positioned on one of the busiest trade routes in the world. But beneath this vision of prosperity, there were forces at work that would test the resilience of all who inhabited it. The very survival of the early settlers was at risk. The Coho people, who had lived on these shores for centuries, were not passive witnesses to this new world. They were its first guardians. The settlers quickly realized that they were not alone in their pursuit of the land, and the competition for control over resources would become a fight for survival as the Dutch East India Company expanded its presence. Its iron grip tightened around the colony's economy, society, and culture. The indigenous populations, initially seen as a labor force, soon became a marginalized group, forced to adapt, resist, or disappear. Simultaneously, enslaved individuals from distant shores were brought to work the fields, their lives defined by brutal conditions and harsh exploitation. The very foundation of the colony was built on these complex and often violent interactions. But these stories of resistance, oppression, and survival remain largely untold. The stakes were not just about land or wealth. They were about identity, cultural survival, and the very essence of what it meant to call the Cape home. But the battle for control would soon evolve into something far more dangerous, a series of events that would leave an indelible mark on the Cape Colony forever. The world at the dawn of the 17th century was a place of intense competition, as European powers sought to carve out their empires across the globe. The age of exploration had brought Europeans to the far corners of the earth, eager to claim new territories, exploit resources, and establish trade routes that would enrich their homelands. In this volatile global stage, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, emerged as a dominant force. By the early 17th century, the VOC controlled the spice trade and had established a series of outposts across the Indian Ocean. But in their ambitions, they set their sights on something even more strategic: Table Bay. At the southern tip of Africa, the Cape Colony was founded in 1652 by the Dutch East India Company. Not as a colony in the traditional sense, but as a way station, a supply base for ships traveling between Europe and the East Indies. The initial plan was simple: a refreshment station that would provide passing ships with fresh water, food, and repairs. But as time passed, the Cape became something far more important. The local indigenous Cocoa people, who had lived on these lands for millennia, found themselves caught between the pull of their ancient traditions and the encroaching presence of European settlers. At first, The cocoa interacted with the Dutch settlers out of necessity. Trade and barter were established cattle for European goods, such as metal tools and beads. But these relationships, though initially peaceful, soon soured as the settlers expanded their settlements, taking land and resources that had been crucial to the cocoa way of life. Tensions escalated, and the peaceful exchanges turned into violent confrontations. This led to the cocoa's gradual displacement, and in many ways, the first chapter of their long struggle for survival in the face of European colonization. The Dutch East India Company's presence began to reshape not just the landscape, but the entire structure of life at the Cape. The VOC was not simply interested in trade. It sought control. By 1732, the company had established a monopoly on land ownership, turning the colony into a plantation economy reliant on forced labor. The expansion of the settlement was inextricably tied to the arrival of enslaved people first, from the East Indies, later from the African continent, and even from Madagascar. These enslaved individuals were the backbone of the Cape Colony's growth, building roads, cultivating crops, and maintaining the fledgling infrastructure. However, their plight and resistance often went unnoticed, their stories buried beneath the dominant narrative of colonial success. By the time the British arrived in 1806, the Cape Colony was a melting pot of cultures, languages, and tensions. The British takeover was not a simple military conquest. It was the result of a delicate balance of political maneuvering, trade interests, and global rivalries. The British had an eye on Cape Town not only as a strategic port, but as a gateway to the riches of the Indian Ocean. With the British arrival, the control of the Cape was passed from one European power to another, but the local indigenous populations and enslaved individuals remained at the mercy of foreign powers. The social fabric of the Cape Colony was rapidly changing, with the British imposing new policies that conflicted with the Dutch system. The status of the enslaved was debated. Some were promised freedom, while others were forced into new systems of labor. As tensions between the settlers, enslaved people, and indigenous groups escalated, a complex web of relationships developed, one marked by resistance, negotiation, and survival. In the background of this complex interplay, one thing remained clear: the untold stories of those who lived and died in the shadow of empire. Stories of struggle and survival that shaped the course of South African history in ways that are often overlooked. But as the Cape's population grew, so did the hidden forces that would forever alter the course of its history, forces far beyond the control of any empire. In 1758, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, introduced the first enslaved individuals to the Cape Colony. These people, brought from distant lands like the East Indies, Madagascar, and Africa, were not just laborers. They were the foundation upon which the colony's economy would be built. The VOC, seeking to establish a self-sustaining outpost, relied on forced labor to cultivate crops, construct buildings, and support the growing settlement. The first enslaved were mostly men and women captured in the East Indies, a Dutch colony far to the east. These individuals were taken from their homelands, torn from families, and brought across vast oceans to serve the ambitions of a European empire. Their lives were no longer their own. Stripped of their names, their languages, and their cultures, they were reduced to commodities, property to be bought, sold, and controlled. They were placed in the homes of the settlers, in farms, and on plantations, tasks that were grueling, dangerous, and unrelenting. But in the midst of their hardship, these enslaved people resisted in subtle, often unseen ways. Some sabotaged the work they were given, others attempted to escape, running into the unforgiving wilderness surrounding the colony. Though the settlers viewed them as expendable, the enslaved people were far from passive. They fought back, in their own quiet but persistent manner, against the lives that had been forced upon them. However, their struggle was one that rarely made it into official records. The VOC saw only their labor, and the stories of these enslaved individuals were hidden behind the veil of colonial expansion. The stories of their resistance and survival would remain buried for generations, overshadowed by the more glorified accounts of European settlement. But just as the VOC was consolidating its power, a new chapter in the colony's story was about to unfold, one that would change the relationship between the settlers and the enslaved forever. In 1766, the Meermin, a Dutch slave ship, set sail from the East Indies, carrying enslaved individuals destined for the Cape Colony. Among them were men and women from Madagascar who had endured the harrowing voyage in chains, subjected to the brutal conditions of the ship's lower decks. But this voyage would not go as planned. The enslaved passengers, who had been treated with cruelty and inhumanity, staged a revolt that would become one of the most significant acts of resistance in Cape Colony history. The mutiny aboard the Meermin was not a sudden outburst, but a calculated act of defiance born from weeks of suffering. As the ship sailed closer to the Cape, a group of enslaved Malagasy men rose up against their captors. Armed with whatever makeshift weapons they could find, they overwhelmed the crew, seizing control of the ship. Their plan was simple: escape to freedom, far away from the hands of their captors. However, their success was short-lived. The mutiny was swiftly suppressed by the remaining crew and reinforcements from the Cape. The consequences for the rebels were swift and merciless. The majority of those who had participated in the revolt were executed. Their bodies were left to hang as a grim reminder to any who might dare to resist. The survivors were brutally punished, returned to slavery, and forced to serve under even harsher conditions. Yet, despite their defeat, the Meermin mutiny became a symbol of resistance, a testament to the unwillingness of the enslaved to accept their fate without struggle. It was a spark, though short-lived, that illuminated the depth of their suffering and the power of their desire for freedom. The Meermin mutiny, though largely forgotten by history, is a poignant reminder that resistance is often born in the most unlikely of circumstances, and that even in the darkest hours, the human spirit cannot be fully extinguished. Though the mutineers were defeated, their legacy of defiance would echo in the years to come, inspiring others to challenge the unyielding chains of slavery. As the Cape Colony continued to expand, the abolition of slavery in 1834 marked a monumental shift in the colony's labor system. However, this so-called liberation did not signal the end of exploitation. Instead, it gave rise to a new form of control: the inbox-stelsel, a system that would ensnare many of the colony's indigenous people and former slaves in a cycle of forced labor that would persist long after slavery was formally abolished. Under the inbox-stelsel, individuals mostly from the Cocoa communities were legally bound to work for their former masters in exchange for the promise of land or pay. But this was often a false hope. Once bound by this system, they were effectively stripped of their autonomy, as their labor became the property of another. While many were classified as apprentices, they were in reality little more than indentured laborers, often subjected to harsh conditions similar to those of slavery. These agreements, often made when children were young, tied them to their employers for years, sometimes decades, in a form of unfree labor that was nearly indistinguishable from the institution of slavery itself. The inbox-stelsel system was a crucial mechanism in maintaining the colonial economy, especially on the farms that dotted the Cape's landscape. As the settlers sought to replace enslaved labor, the system provided them with a steady stream of cheap, coerced labor. Children, in particular, were vulnerable to the system, often being taken from their families and forced into work from an early age. The young and the vulnerable were particularly targeted, their futures determined by contracts that offered no freedom, only a lifetime of servitude. Resistance to this system was subtle but persistent. The Cocoa and other indigenous groups would attempt to resist the terms of their contracts, seeking to escape or to negotiate better conditions. Yet, The imbostelcel was deeply ingrained in the colonial infrastructure, and escape was often a dangerous and uncertain option. The echoes of slavery continued in this new system, perpetuating a cycle of labor exploitation that would haunt the colony for years to come. This system would lay the groundwork for a darker chapter in South Africa's history, one that still affects its communities today. In November of 1809, the Cape Colony saw the introduction of one of its most notorious laws, the Hottentot Proclamation, a decree that would forever alter the lives of the indigenous Coco people. Issued by the British colonial government, this proclamation was a blatant attempt to assert control over the land and its original inhabitants, severely restricting their movements and subjecting them to a new form of legal control. The Hottentot Proclamation forbade the Coco people from leaving the areas where they had lived for generations without permission from the colonial authorities. It was designed to restrict their autonomy, ensuring that they could not freely roam the land or seek refuge in neighboring areas. Those who did attempt to leave without permission were considered criminals and were subjected to punishment, including corporal punishment or being sent to work under even harsher conditions. The law was clear in its intent: to subjugate the Coco people and turn them into a cheap, controllable labor force for the British settlers. The proclamation was not only a tool for colonial control. It was also a deliberate erasure of the Coco's traditional ways of life. For centuries, the Coco had moved freely across the land, interacting with the environment and their neighbors according to their ancient customs. The British, however, saw this mobility as a threat to their plans for agricultural development and settlement expansion. By forcing the Coco into static labor roles, the British government sought to break their cultural ties to the land, replacing their independence with dependency. The impact of the Hottentot Proclamation was immediate and devastating. It led to the forced confinement of Coco families, disrupting their traditional lifestyles and leading to widespread poverty and social disintegration. It also laid the groundwork for later laws that would further restrict the freedoms of indigenous people, particularly during the apartheid era. The decree was an early example of the brutal policies that would continue to haunt South Africa's history for centuries to come. But these laws were only a part of a much greater plan to control the indigenous population, one that would unfold with even greater severity in the years to come. The Slave Lodge in Cape Town, constructed in 1679, stands as one of the most enduring symbols of the Cape Colony's reliance on slavery. Initially built to house enslaved individuals brought in to support the colony's burgeoning economy, the lodge became a focal point for the brutal system of human exploitation that would define the colony for centuries. Its location, just a stone's throw from the governor's residence, was a constant reminder of the stark social and racial divides that separated the colonial elite from the enslaved. The lodge was not merely a place of temporary shelter. It was a holding facility where enslaved people were confined before being assigned to their owners. It was overcrowded, unsanitary, and inhumane, a stark contrast to the privileges of the settlers living nearby. The conditions inside were brutal, with little regard for the health or well-being of the individuals housed there. Many of the enslaved were held for long periods, isolated from their families, and subjected to harsh treatment and constant surveillance. But the Slave Lodge was not simply a place of oppression. It was also a space where resistance and community were born. Within its walls, the enslaved found ways to support one another, exchanging stories and strategies for survival. Some tried to escape, risking their lives to flee into the wilderness, while others fought back through subtle forms of resistance, sabotaging work, slowing down production, or even starting small revolts. The lodge also became a place of significant cultural and social interaction, as enslaved individuals from various parts of Africa, Madagascar, and the East Indies were brought together. Despite the efforts to strip them of their identities, These individuals found ways to maintain their traditions, speak their languages, and preserve their heritage. The slave lodge, though a symbol of their oppression, also became a focal point for the survival of their cultures and the forging of new communal bonds. Hidden beneath the lodge's stones lay secrets that many would go to great lengths to keep hidden, and its walls would witness more than just the struggles of the enslaved. In 1849, a new chapter of turmoil unfolded in the Cape Colony with the arrival of convict ships from Britain. The British government, seeking to relieve the strain on its overcrowded prisons, decided to send convicts to the Cape, ostensibly to help with labor and development in the colony. However, their arrival sparked an unprecedented crisis, as Cape Town residents, particularly those in the settler class, vehemently opposed the influx of convicts. The fear of crime and disorder ran high. The settlers, who had already endured the tensions of colonial life, viewed the convicts not only as a threat to their safety, but as an undesirable addition to the already volatile social fabric of the colony. Many feared that the convicts would disrupt the delicate balance between settlers, enslaved individuals, and indigenous groups. To the settlers, this was more than just an issue of labor. It was an assault on their moral and social order. This backlash culminated in the so-called convict crisis, a period of intense resistance to the British government's policies. The crisis reached its peak when local protests turned violent, with mass demonstrations and petitions to halt the shipment of convicts. For many Cape Town residents, the arrival of the convicts was not just about labor, but about the perceived degradation of their social and racial status. The crisis underscored the growing divide between the British authorities and the settler population, further straining relations and adding to the unrest already simmering in the colony. Despite the protests, the British government pressed on with its plans, and the convicts were put to work in the colony's growing infrastructure projects. However, the convict crisis left an indelible mark on the Cape's political landscape, highlighting the simmering tensions between the British authorities and the settlers, tensions that would continue to shape the colony's future. The repercussions of this crisis would ripple across Cape Town's political landscape, forever altering the course of its future, ushering in a new era of British control, and further fracturing the colony's fragile unity. The Coho people, indigenous to the Cape, were among the first to encounter European settlers. As the Dutch East India Company, VOC, established its foothold in the region, the Coho found themselves both essential to the colonial economy and deeply marginalized by the settlers who sought to control the land and its resources. Initially, the Coco were seen by the Dutch as a source of labor. Their vast knowledge of the land, animals, and local trade networks made them invaluable to the settlers. The Coco were skilled herders and agriculturalists, and they played a crucial role in the colony's early economy by supplying the settlers with cattle, food, and other essential resources. In return, the settlers provided metal tools and goods, such as beads, that the Coco had never seen before. However, this trade relationship was far from balanced. The settlers soon grew frustrated by the Coco's resistance to being fully subjugated, and they sought to expand their control over the land through a combination of diplomacy and violence. As the VOC began to expand its territory, it became increasingly clear that the Coco's independence was incompatible with the colonial settlers' ambitions. Over time, the Coco were forced off their land, and their role in the economy shifted from that of trade partners to a controlled labor force. In many cases, they were coerced into working for the settlers, often through threats or violence. The traditional economy of the Coco, based on the free movement of herds and barter, was systematically dismantled. The Coco resistance, however, did not disappear. They continued to resist settler expansion, fighting to maintain control over their land and culture. As the VOC and later the British continued to push for more land and resources, the Coco would become embroiled in a series of conflicts that would define their relationship with the colonizers for generations. Despite their marginalization, the cocoa would continue to play an integral role in the shaping of the colony's economy, both as a source of labor and as a symbol of resistance against colonial oppression. But as the cocoa's power waned, and their stories were buried by the colonial machine, their resistance would not be forgotten. It would fuel the fires of rebellion, contributing to the VOC's decline and sparking a new chapter in the colony's fight for freedom. By the late 18th century, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, was a shadow of its former self. Once the dominant maritime and commercial power in the world, the VOC had begun to show signs of deep internal decay. Mismanagement, corruption, and mounting financial problems plagued the company, causing its once unassailable control over the Cape Colony and much of the trade route it protected to weaken. The company's expansive operations, initially built on the profits from the spice trade and its strategic role at the Cape, were crumbling under the weight of its own excesses. For decades, the VOC had relied on the labor of enslaved people and the strategic importance of the Cape as a refueling station for European ships heading to the East Indies. However, the company's greed had caught up with it. Inefficient administration, a lack of coherent leadership, and increasing competition from other European powers, particularly the British, eroded its monopoly. As the wealth from the spice trade diminished, the VOC increasingly turned to exploitation, relying on oppressive systems like the inbox-stelsel to extract labor, as well as the forced control over indigenous groups like the cocoa to maintain its hold on the colony. Amidst the VOC's decline, the growing restlessness of the enslaved population, the cocoa resistance, and mounting financial struggles made the Cape an increasingly unstable region. The company's inability to maintain control over its territories became glaringly apparent. The once proud Dutch East India Company had become a bloated, inefficient institution, beset by political infighting and incapable of adapting to the new economic realities of the 19th century. By 1806, the VOC's weakening grip on the Cape Colony was shattered when the British seized control during the Napoleonic Wars. The British saw the colony as a critical strategic point in the global conflict, and the fall of the VOC was the opening they needed. The British takeover was not merely a change of power. It was the beginning of a new colonial era, one that would bring further oppression to the cocoa and enslaved populations, but also ignite the sparks of rebellion and resistance that would continue to challenge colonial authority. With the Dutch out and the British in, the Cape Colony was thrust into a new era, one where new power struggles, rebellions, and shifts in labor systems would reshape the colony's future in ways no one could yet predict. On 1 December 1834, a monumental change swept through the Cape Colony with the abolition of slavery. This marked the end of an era of brutal exploitation, where enslaved individuals had been the backbone of the colonies economy, laboring in fields, building infrastructure, and serving the colonial elite. The British, now in control of the colony, passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which freed thousands of enslaved individuals in the Cape. Yet, this so-called freedom was far from liberating for many. For the enslaved, freedom was a promise, but not a guarantee. The immediate aftermath of emancipation saw many former slaves remain in a state of dependence, bound to their former masters through indentured labor agreements. These agreements, though technically free from the chains of slavery, often resulted in working conditions that were equally harsh. The promise of land or payment was largely illusory, and many former slaves found themselves trapped in a system where they had little choice but to continue working for their previous owners under even harsher terms. The economic structure of the Cape Colony, long dependent on slave labor, had no immediate plan to transition away from this exploitative system. The freed individuals were often left with no means of survival, and so many continued to work under oppressive conditions. Now legally free, but still shackled by economic necessity and systemic discrimination. The social landscape remained unchanged. Land was still in the hands of the settlers, and the cocoa and black communities faced continued marginalization. The abolition of slavery did not lead to a sudden transformation of Cape society. Instead, it deepened the contradictions within it, revealing the limits of colonial freedom and the ongoing exploitation of labor. The former enslaved, though legally free, found themselves in a new kind of servitude, one that would continue for generations, shaping the social and economic divisions of South Africa for years to come. Though slavery was officially abolished, the struggle for real freedom was far from over. The legacy of exploitation and resistance would echo through generations, shaping the very fabric of society in the Cape Colony and beyond. The abolition of slavery in the Cape Colony did not erase the scars left by centuries of exploitation. Though legally free, the enslaved people's descendants continued to face immense challenges, and the legacy of their suffering, resistance, and survival shaped the social and cultural landscape of South Africa for generations to come. The immediate aftermath of emancipation saw many former slaves remain in precarious situations, tied to the very systems that had once enslaved them. Land, wealth, and power were still concentrated in the hands of the European settlers, leaving little opportunity for the formerly enslaved to build independent lives. While some sought to form new communities or return to their ancestral lands, the reality was that their freedom was limited by poverty, landlessness, and racial discrimination. The entrenched hierarchies of colonial society ensured that their status as free people was not fully recognized by those in power. Despite these challenges, the legacy of enslaved communities was far from one of silence or passivity. The resilience of the enslaved people carried forward through their descendants, who fought for better living conditions, rights, and recognition in a society that continued to marginalize them. Their stories of resistance, whether through subtle acts of defiance during slavery or more overt challenges to apartheid later, became part of the collective memory of South Africa. Culturally, the enslaved brought with them a rich heritage that blended African, Malagasy, and Eastern influences, which would go on to shape South African identity. Their languages, traditions, music, and religious practices formed the foundation of many aspects of South African culture. The generations that followed would draw on these roots to create new identities, weaving together the diverse strands of South Africa's complex social fabric. The legacy of the enslaved is not just one of hardship, but also of survival, transformation, and influence. Their struggle, while never fully acknowledged during their lifetimes, contributed to the cultural and political movements that would later reshape the nation. From the fight against apartheid to the ongoing struggle for equality and justice, legacy of the enslaved lives on, not just in history books, but in the very soul of South Africa, a nation built on their blood, sweat, and dreams of freedom. The legacy of the Cape Colony's enslaved communities is deeply embedded in South African society. While slavery was abolished, the social and economic effects lingered. The fight for true freedom went beyond the end of slavery. It was about dismantling the systems of inequality that had endured for centuries. For the formerly enslaved and their descendants, the struggle continued through resistance to new forms of oppression. Despite emancipation, discriminatory laws like land dispossession and forced labor persisted, and the majority of the population remained marginalized. Yet the enslaved people's legacy is not just one of hardship, but of resilience and cultural survival. Culturally, they left an indelible mark. The blend of African, Malagasy, Indian, and Indonesian heritage shaped South Africa's identity, influencing language, music, cuisine, and spiritual practices. These traditions became the foundation of modern South African culture, enriching it with diversity. The descendants of the enslaved would go on to play central roles in South Africa's fight for liberation. The story of the enslaved people, of survival against brutality and hope against despair, is a testament to the human spirit's strength and the ongoing struggle for justice. As we reflect on the untold secrets of the Cape Colony, we are reminded that history is not merely the story of rulers and empires, but of the countless lives that have shaped it. The legacy of the enslaved people, once hidden beneath layers of colonial silence, now stands as a powerful force of resistance and resilience. Their stories of hardship, survival, and cultural preservation have shaped the nation in ways that cannot be erased by time. In remembering these histories, we honor not just the struggles of the past, but the strength of those who overcame them. Their legacy continues to shape the South Africa of today, a country still healing from the wounds of its colonial past, but also rising with the strength of its people. As we close this chapter of history, let us remember, the fight for freedom is ongoing, and the stories of those who fought for it will never be forgotten.